Welcome to the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge for May 21st, 2018. Thank you for joining us. We have several councilors that are not with us tonight. Ms. Hoppy will not be with us. Ms. Dozeman, I believe, is running late, and Mr. Pond had another engagement and may make it but may not. But I'm glad for all of you that joined us and the members of the audience. Why don't we get going here with item number 1, West Metro Fire District update, and would Chief Lombardi join us at the table here and grab a microphone and hit the little button, and you'll be.
Is that good right there?
You're live.
Perfect. Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for having me. I want to give you an update on some things that are changing at West Metro Fire Rescue that I think is pretty exciting news. So one of the things is when we merged up with Wheat Ridge Fire Protection District, we talked about with all of you our depth of service and high level of service that we bring to the community, and that we are an internationally accredited fire agency. And when you look at the pinnacles in the fire service, that's one of them. Another one has to do with insurance ratings, and you may have heard of ISO ratings, fire ratings for insurance. ISO stands for Insurance Service Office. It's a group that comes out and looks at your community, looks at your fire department, and then rates the fire service for that community. And so they look at fire station placement, they look at number of personnel, number of rigs, types of rigs, of apparatus that we have. They look at our water system. Do you know how many water districts we have just in West Metro's district? 28 that we work with. So when we look at that, they rate us on that. They look at our communication center. They looked at our new JeffCom, which they rated as high as you could get, and they thought it was outstanding. They also look at our training records. They go through this whole myriad of things, and then they come back and they give you, they rate you on a scale of 1 to 10. And they also look at our community risk reduction programs that we have. So when they rate you on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the very best protection you can have rating, and then 10 being not like no fire service. So West Metro had been a 3 for quite some time, and which is very good. There's not a lot that are a 3. And so if you remember, Wheat Ridge Fire Protection District was a 2 right before we merged up. But now we got the ISO rating of 1. So when you look at that, and then you couple that with us being an accredited agency, there's only 60 agencies in the United States that have an ISO rating of 1 and are internationally accredited, and that's your fire department. So we're very, very excited about that. So what does all that mean from an ISO standpoint or insurance standpoint? What they do is that many insurance companies use ISO to help set their rates for communities, set their insurance rates, both homeowners rates and commercial rates. And so this is one tool that they use, but we think by going from an ISO rating of 3 down to a 1, that again, everything being equal, that you didn't have a big hailstorm that came through or claims or things like this, but everything being equal, we think that a person with a $300,000 home should see a reduction of about $200 per year in their homeowners insurance rates, which when you look at that, that's not too bad. So when you look at our whole district, that's millions of dollars of savings for our taxpayers. And so that is today, starting May 1st, is when ISO let all of the insurance companies know of our new rating. So homeowners can call up and talk to their agents and say, okay, I heard West Metro is an ISO 1. How can then we enjoy that, or how can our rates come down? The other part of it is, from a business perspective, is we think that business owners for their commercial property should be able to save 2 to 5% on their commercial rates. So again, millions of dollars we think will be saved for those that live within our district. And then looking at our community partners over here, and when we talk to you about this, which is very, very important to me, is that we're very much integrated with what all you do. And so when we talk about partnerships, and we talk about business development, this should be another way for you all to attract business to Wheat Ridge, because you can say that your fire service is a full service fire department, and that it also is internationally accredited, but also has an ISO rating of 1. Our friends to the north of us don't get to say that. And so when they look at, should I come here or should I go there, that should be at least, I think, an enhancer to say, come to Wheat Ridge, and this is a place you want your business, the community, everything about it, plus a little bit of savings from your fire department. So we're very, very excited about that. Another thing that we're very excited about is a new service we're providing, which actually started today, and that has to do with what's called an ARM car, Advanced Resource Medic, ARM. And what that is, so West Metro and our predecessors before us, we've done what we called, and I think we've talked about this, is fire-based EMS. And that's where we have firefighters that are firefighter paramedics, and we have paramedics on every single one of our rigs, and then also we do medical transport. So we transport people to the hospital, fire-based EMS. We've done that for almost 50 years. And in essence, our service has basically stayed the same. But we have found that we have two choices when we go out when we get a call for 911. The choices are that we will transport you to the hospital, or if you don't want to go to the hospital, we leave you there. That's it, one or the other. Now that means that not every call that we go on really needs to have a transport to the emergency room, but needs some sort of medical treatment or medical care. And we know that there's been a gap that's been missing for a long, long time. So you look at it from our standpoint, when we transport someone, the average bill is about $1,200 for transport, which is about the norm for the metro area, $1,200. Then when you get to the emergency room, you have the emergency room charges plus. So you can see how those costs add up. And especially when a person doesn't have to or doesn't need to be at the emergency room but needs some sort of care. So we're doing the latest thing in the fire service is what's called either community paramedicine or mobile integrated healthcare. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. I think it's more of a describer than an actual thing. But a lot of different agencies are trying different programs. The reason a lot of those don't work is because they've never figured out how to do or make it sustainable. And so I think we've come upon something that will work. We're going through we have a partnership, a public-private partnership with Dispatch Health. So Dispatch Health today, they are out in our community and they do contracts with some of the senior living centers or where we have senior living folks, and they'll contract with them. And they've got nurse practitioners or physician assistants in these little Priuses, and there's this little app that they use, and they use this app and they come out and provide care. But it's just not going like they think it should. So in a public-private partnership with us, we are going to marry up with them and provide this advanced resource medic. So this car is in service 40 hours a week, 4 10-hour days for right now. I think that our demographics will show that we could put more cars in service more of the time. But so right now it's starting off at 40 hours, and what happens is we have a paramedic that has advanced training in higher level skills than just a regular paramedic. And they're partnered with this, either a physician's assistant or nurse practitioner from Dispatch Health. So today, how it's going to work is a call will come in for 911. We'll still send our engine, we'll still send our medic unit there. They get there and they go, you know what? I don't think you need to go to the hospital, but you need some sort of care. And that could be because we have the ability to do on-site laboratory work. On-site, we can prescribe medications, we can do sutures. So things that are like from a cold to urinary tract infection to, we had one in our pilot program where a grandfather was watching his 2-year-old grandson. He was running around, fell, and then cut his head. So he called 911, we come out, it was a perfect call for the arm car. They come out, the nurse practitioner puts stitches in, and the grandson was eating ice cream even before we could have transported him typically to the hospital in our medic unit. So we think that we can provide this gap for medical care. The cool thing about it is, because this public-private partnership that we have with them, Dispatch Health has contracted with every insurance company in the state of Colorado, including Medicare and Medicaid. So the charges that they do, if anybody has those, will end up being just a copay. If they don't have insurance, or they don't want to pay the copay, the most it'll cost them is $275. That's for all the lab work, that's even for medications, things on that order. We'll even do a follow-up care. We're not trying to replace their primary care physician or their typical route, but we think because they call 911, there's a gap in there, because every single call is does not need a transport to the hospital. Sometimes we go on folks that call us a lot for a variety of reasons. We just had one that somebody had shingles and couldn't get in to see her physician, and she was in so much pain she calls us. Well, that's a perfect thing for this arm car, where we get to prescribe medications and then do follow-up care. So we think that by providing the service at that rate, insurance companies now will pay for those, and then this is where the sustainability part comes in. We have now, with this partnership, it allows us into what the cost it does for us to provide the service. The dollars that come back from the insurance companies to pay for this help offset our costs. And again, I'm not saying it's a money maker, but when we reduce our cost on this allows us to provide this service or make it more sustainable. So we're starting off for the rest of the year at 40 hours a week. I'm confident that we'll be able to put more cars in service and put more and have more time, 7 days a week, and do this more. And then when you look at this again, from what we save our taxpayers in healthcare costs for doing it this way, again, we think that there's a lot of dollars, millions of dollars, we think, that can be diverted or put back, and that's not part of them going, and I'm not going to say frivolously, but them going to unnecessarily having to go to the emergency room. And again, you all know that they're overloaded and all the things that go along with that. So those are two things that we're doing right now at West Metro that we think really in different ways help our community out, help our taxpayers out with providing with some savings, some money on that. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. It started today. And again, like I said, I think we can expand as we go along. I think the demographics within West Metro's district, and especially with here in Wheat Ridge, we have an elder community, more senior community. We have a lot of different needs within our community. I think that this will fit right into that. So I wanted to give you a heads up on all that.
Thank you, Chief. Do we have any questions for the Chief? Mr. Rand.
I have a couple questions. One is to Patrick. Can we somehow link everything that West Metro is doing onto our website so our citizens are aware of even our rating, the service, that you're providing, the great one you just told me about, which I think is fantastic?
Yeah, we can provide something.
And I'll
Don, and we'll figure out what's most appropriate.
Okay.
we'll get that on there.
Yeah, that would be great. The question I have is, my understanding is you are preparing a proposal for urban renewal regarding, just correct me if I'm wrong, regarding moving forward with any development coming forward in the city as far as the fire department. Can you kind of give me an update on that and kind of tell me where that is?
So we've met with the urban renewal folks, and the reason for the meeting was we wanted to come up with some sort of a more concrete agreement and more agreement that's in writing. Before, if you remember, being back on the Wheat Ridge Fire Protection District Board, you probably remember this, that Wheat Ridge Fire and the city of Wheat Ridge had an agreement that wherever urban renewal was going, that they would get 100% of the tax increment finance. And so through that, we just need to settle on something that's probably a little more formal with that. And I think that we sent a proposal over to the Urban Renewal Board, met with them for quite some time, and then sent a proposal over. They've countered with that now. And I think where it's not at 100%, like what Wheat Ridge Fire had on there. There's some elements of it that make it at least workable for West Metro. And the reason, we get so sensitive about that is any time that we get diminished revenues, because we're only a single source revenue, property taxes for most of us. I mean, we get a little bit from ambulance transports, but that's really an offset of what it costs. And so when we see threats to that, it perks up my ears a little bit, because when we have one single resource coming in, and we provide typically one thing, fire and EMS and emergency services. So when people say, oh, urban renewal will help you out, I understand the thinking, but we have to look at it from a system-wide, and not that we have less calls at one place. So I have to look at it system-wide. So that's what we're trying to work out now with the Urban Renewal Board. I think we'll be getting back tomorrow with them on that, and I think we can come up with some sort of agreement that works for them and then works for us too. And the other thing too is we want them to be able to, when development's coming in, we want them to be able to come and say, okay, from a fire and emergency services and EMS services, that we need to have it, you need to figure this into your budget, if you will, or you're planning for that. And I think it may have been a little bit difficult before, but I think we can get there. I think, again, it's not what we had thought, but I think we can get there on that.
Okay, well, thank you for doing such a great, wonderful job for our citizens, saving us money. And hopefully, whatever proposal, the final one, can we get a copy of that or have it sent to us?
Yeah, as soon as the Urban Renewal Authority Board makes that decision. They spoke about it, was that last Tuesday? And as the chief mentioned, it's going back and forth between attorneys at this point, so I'm not sure when they're scheduled to discuss it again. I guess it depends when the fire department's attorney gets back to us.
Yeah.
And then, as soon as something's settled, we'll get council a copy.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank
Mr.
you.
Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and appreciate you being here today, and thank you very much for giving us this update. I had a question relating to the opioid addiction crisis and what impact that's had on the fire department, and what, if anything, the fire department has had to deal with in that regard.
Well, it's interesting because I just came back from a conference that the Vancouver fire chief was talking about their opioid crisis, and what's happening there is nothing like here. Although, I mean, it's here. It very much is, but I will say that because I've been trying to look back, what they're, the biggest things now is they're coming out and saying, oh, we're going to give everybody Narcan and start using Narcan. I said, well, we've been using that for 25 years. That's what takes away, the effects of the opioid. So we do use it a lot. We do work with our police partners in, how it gets administered and things like this, and if they can administer it as well too, and then how we collaborate with them. But it is here. It very much is here, and it is a problem. From West Metro's standpoint, I think right now we can manage the capacity of it right now, but long-term, all of us, when I say all of us, you as local folks that make ordinances and that you decide on how things should go for our community, and then us from the fire department side of it, we're going to have to make some tough choices coming down the pike that probably aren't so popular today. There's the things like they're doing up in Vancouver. It is beyond me that they have public places where people go and shoot up. And then they give out this Narcan, this naloxone, they give out to family members. It's getting in Vancouver, it's getting administered even before fire personnel, EMS personnel even are close to being there. So it does save lives, but I'm not quite sure that that's, it saves lives. I think it's filling a need. I don't think it's the solution on that, so.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions for the chief? Chief, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.
Appreciate the
really
update,
appreciate it.
and congratulations on
Thanks, I
your
appreciate it. Thanks for your
last
time.
one.
I really appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Chief. Okay, we will move on to item number 2 on our agenda, which is electronic security fences, special use permit. Mr. Johnstone's going to give us a brief
Yes.
overview on this.
Thank you, Mayor. We are here to talk for a second time about the possibility of beginning to allow electric fences in Wheat Ridge. We first talked about this with City Council at your May 7th study session, and the consensus direction from Council at that time was to take a look at drafting an ordinance that would allow electrical fences in certain locations in the city with approval of a special use permit. Working with the City Attorney's Office, we have drafted an ordinance that would do just that. By way of background, I think we had this discussion with Council in more detail on the 7th, but the city code is silent to electrical fences. We've historically interpreted electrical fences to be one of the prohibited fences out of concerns for the public safety concerns from that electrification factor. So obviously we're looking at changing that historical position and addressing them specifically in the code. So we've drafted an ordinance. We are proposing that they would be allowed as a use in certain zone districts, notably the C1, the C2, the industrial employment, and planned commercial and planned industrial districts. In the definition of an electrical fence that we would propose to add to the code, we've limited them in height to 9 feet by definition, and also added language that would require a finding that there's a demonstrate need for that security concern based on factors such as excessive criminal activity and theft. So that's the kind of the box that we're attempting to put them in, so that they would be potentially allowed, subject to that meeting of the special use criteria, and subject to those two requirements, the 9-foot height requirement and the presence of excessive criminal activity or other demonstrated need for that type of security in that location. We're prepared to, with Council's direction tonight, to take this to a Planning Commission public hearing in June and have a City Council public hearing on June 25th. Be glad to answer questions.
Thank you. Mr. Johnstone, do we have questions for Mr. Johnstone? Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess one of my questions is, what's the definition of excessive criminal activity in this situation? It could be one potential burglar, and that's the only evidence I have to give you to have a fence. I mean, what's the threshold there to have excessive criminal activity? It seems kind of like a high bar versus all you need is one instance of theft, and that could be excessive. So
Right.
what's the...
Yeah, I think maybe have the chief respond as well, but I think we're looking at there being definitely a trend of there being criminal activity in that area, not just one incident or something like that. So just looking for trend data is what I think the quick answer would be.
Okay, and then as it relates to the definition of an electrically charged fence, it indicates that this is more of a deterrent as opposed to an alarm. And when we talked with the folks representing the fence company, they indicated it was more of an alarm mechanism than a physical deterrent type activity. So how do we make a distinction between those that trip an alarm, so it's electrified in that sense, versus ones that give you a jolt?
So it's both. An alarm system is a deterrent. That's why people put out signs that say my home is protected by ADT. It would deter crime. It's also an alarm, and as Mr. Pate had talked about, it's a verified alarm. We have a verified alarm policy here. We don't respond to every silent alarm or burglar alarm unless it's verified, because we don't have the staffing or the resources to do it, and 97% of those alarms are false.
And we also, Zach, we went to, or we found from Electric Guard Dog, they have a model ordinance that they've been using to encourage cities to adopt some kind of code. And so we use the same language they use, their model ordinance.
Mr. Johnstone, this fence would need to be erected in association with another perimeter fence, and that could be any kind of fence, could be a split rail fence or something of that nature?
Well, I think as a practical matter, I think we probably wanted to be looking at a higher fence
and something that's more solid. So it could be a chain link, which is what has been proposed in the context of or what exists in the context of the Kettleson property. I think it could be a solid wood as well, but the idea would be to prevent as much contact, kind of accidental contact with that electrified fence.
Right. Do you think the ordinance could or should have that kind of qualification on what the secondary or maybe the primary fence would be?
I think it certainly could. I think the language of special use permits in general gives the approving body, whether that be the community development director or city council, the authority to impose conditions. So what we would anticipate would be requiring that as a condition of approval, is that some sort of a fence be installed. I think it could be contextual to the extent that, if there's an existing fence there and it's acceptable, wouldn't necessarily want to require a new one. If there isn't an existing fence there, then we'd have more discretion to, determine what that should look like, working with the property owner. I think the other reason that we kept the language maybe a little bit loose was that, obviously we've been working with Electric Guard Dog on this matter, and they propose, I think currently, an 8-inch separation between those two fences. Working with other property owners or other electric fence companies that I presume exist, those nuances of what that design installation looks like may be a little bit different.
Okay. And the 9-foot height, was that mainly driven from the Kettleson example and sort of the 50% increase that you had utilized with respect to their 6-foot fence to get to 9 foot?
It was, yeah, and I think, just in general as a aesthetic matter, and, we can have that discussion, but I think in general we try and limit the height of fences just for aesthetic reasons. Of course, at some point it becomes a wind load issue as well, but I'm not sure how much of an issue that would be with these lighter weight fences, and obviously you just need to engineer around that.
Thank you. Mrs. Dozman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So did you say that the perimeter fence has to be higher than the electrified fence?
No.
Okay.
I think in the Kettleson situation specifically, there's that existing 6-foot fence, and we find that probably to be a pretty acceptable height that makes it difficult to get over or reach over.
Additional questions or comments for Mr. Johnstone? Mr. Urban.
Yes, as it relates to the distance between that perimeter fence and the electrified fence, is there a set requirement for what that is? Because we talked about sort of that dead space in between there.
Right, and so we've left that language open. Obviously the Electric Guard Dog folks objected to the 3-foot distance for a variety of reasons that they expressed at that meeting, and I think we agree, I guess, at this point, while we, I think, still have some concerns with that, that potential issue of reaching through, depending on the particulars of the setup. But I think it's understood that that would be some distance, probably less than a foot in most cases, and just have to work with the specific installer as to what they recommend would be the most appropriate distance.
Thank you.
Additional questions or comments? All right. Are we looking for some direction, consensus?
Yeah,
to move this forward?
consensus to bring the draft ordinance forward to the Planning Commission, and then, as Ken mentioned, public hearing would be on June 25th with City Council.
Do we have a consensus to bring this forward?
I'm kind of on the fence.
Okay, looks like we have consensus to bring this forward on the schedule that you outlined for us.
Thank you all.
Mr. Johnstone, Chief, thanks for joining us. All right. Okay, we're going to move on to item number 3. This is a joint meeting with the Wheat Ridge Urban Renewal Authority. Clear Creek Crossing financing agreements. If the authority members are here, if you would join us at the table, we'd be happy to have you join us.
Reluctantly.
And do they have counsel or?
Not tonight. Not
Okay.
tonight. Andrew and Tim, you can also start
Okay,
coming up if you
please.
want. And you want to sit on the corner here and and we'll get going.
Please have a seat.
Ready to go?
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I think since we've got some new people at the table, why don't we go around and introduce ourselves? My name is Bud Starker, and I'm the mayor of Wheat Ridge.
Thank you. Andrew Knutson, Principal with Economic and Planning Systems.
Tim Morzell, Senior Associate with Economic and Planning Systems.
I'm Val Nosler-Beck, and I'm on the Urban Renewal.
I'm Tim Rogers, and I'm also on the Urban Renewal Authority.
Jim Barenberg, Urban Renewal.
Walt Pettit, Urban Renewal.
I'm Leah Dozman, a city councilwoman from District 4.
Christy Davis, City Council person from District 2 and also on the Urban Renewal.
Tim Fitzgerald, City Council.
Larry Matthews, City Council.
Zachary Urban, Wheat Ridge City Council.
Monica Duran, Wheat Ridge City Council, District 1.
Jerry Dahl, City Attorney.
Patrick Goff, City Manager.
Thank you very much. Mr. Goff, do you want to kick off this discussion?
I will. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So tonight before you is a update and discussion for you on the Evergreen Development Project. As you all know, the project has been moving forward. City Council recently approved a rezoning for the site and approved a couple other agreements, which I'll talk about briefly here. But what we're working on right now is a finance agreement, public finance agreement with Evergreen Development Company. They are asking for public assistance for this project. And I think, as most of you know, this has been a very difficult project to develop. Cabela's first came to us in 2003 when they purchased the property many years ago, purchased a gravel pit on the side of the interstate that has basically no access into the site. As the current developer says, he's basically building a new city out there because there's no infrastructure in place today to serve any type of development. So there's a lot of challenges to get this project completed, and one of those challenges is the financing. There definitely is a gap in the pro forma to make this project pencil for the developer. We're still determining how much of that gap is appropriate and how much public assistance should help fill that gap. But the developer has requested a certain amount. They're looking at a $20 million range to help finance the project. And they're looking or asking for sharing of several different city and urban renewal authority revenue sources to help with that. So they're asking for the urban renewal authority to contribute property tax TIF. They're looking at a sharing of the city's sales tax, a sharing of the city's lodging tax, sharing of the city's admissions tax, a sharing of the city's use tax. They proposed some different percentages of what they're asking for, but those are the numbers that we are still negotiating with the developer. In the information that's been provided in your packet, it's a summary and analysis completed by EPS, who's here tonight, and they'll go through that in a little bit more detail. It doesn't have any conclusions at the end. Again, we're still working on that. We have a meeting scheduled this Friday with the developer and their bond counsel to see what the final numbers potentially are going to look like. So with that, before I turn it over to EPS, I just want to run through a few other documents that City Council is going to be seeing in the near future for this project to move forward. In your memo that was in your packet, the first three items that I listed were already approved by City Council on March 26th. And those all had to do with the construction of the hook ramps on I-70. And so those three have already been approved. That project has been let, and we did receive 5 bids, I believe, last Friday. I haven't seen those yet. Those are being conducted by Mortensen Engineering, and hopefully we'll see those soon. A few other agreements, in addition to the public finance agreement, that will be a separate agreement. A few other agreements that will come from or in front of council. Actually, a couple terminations of agreements that are going to come to council. We're shooting for June 25th for most of these items. We're going to ask council to terminate and release the original annexation agreement that was was approved by City Council in 2004. That was basically an annexation agreement between Cabela's and Coors and the city for them to annex 230 acres into the city. As you know, that project didn't move forward, so that agreement is not necessarily needed. Anything that was in that agreement that is still needed for the city's purposes or the developer's purposes will be incorporated into a new IGA. Then also there was an IGA associated with that annexation agreement in 2006, again, which was very specific to the Cabela's deal. So we're going to ask council to terminate that IGA also on June 25th. And again, anything that was in that IGA that needs to be memorialized and saved for current time will be incorporated into a new IGA. And then there will be an ordinance. First reading, we're shooting for June 11th, but we have to have council approve an ordinance to share some of those different revenue sources that I mentioned. So an emissions tax credit, a sales tax credit, and a lodgings tax credit. There will be an ordinance drafted. There already has been one drafted that will implement the sharing of those credits in the percentage and dollar amount yet to be determined. Item 7 is a PIF collecting agent agreement. The developer is proposing also, in addition to the credits on the admissions and sales and lodging tax, they're also proposing to put a public improvement fee on top of that. That's a developer fee. That's not a city fee. It acts like a tax, but it's not a tax. It's a fee. Most of the developments around Wheat Ridge that you've seen over the last decade or so have a PIF. Belmar, the Mills, the Walmart down here on Colfax, and the Walmart in Lakeside. It's a very popular fee that the consumer does pay, but it doesn't come from the city's coffers. So the city will act as the agent to collect those PIF revenues along with the sales tax revenues from those sites, and then we'll submit those PIF revenues to the developer to pay the bonds that will be issued for this project. Then I mentioned the public finance agreement, which we'll speak about more in detail tonight, is scheduled for June 25th. The Urban Renewal Authority will also consider a public finance agreement on their own to deal with the property tax TIF. And lastly, you'll also see an amended and restated Longs Peak Metropolitan District Service Plan. So a service plan, metropolitan districts are a common tool in Colorado to help finance public infrastructure needs for projects. Longs Peak Metropolitan District was formed back in 2006. State statute requires that the City Council approves the service plan for the Metropolitan District, and the City Council did do that back in 2006. It needs to be amended and restated to be more specific to the Clear Creek Crossing project instead of the Cabela's project. There potentially could be one other agreement that we're working on, but I won't get into that tonight. Hopefully there's not too many other, but I just wanted to give council a heads up that there's going to be quite a few different documents coming forward to council for consideration if this project continues moving forward. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over, and we've hired EPS to help us with this project. They've worked on several other city projects. They've been doing a great job for us, so we're happy to have them on board for this project. I just want to turn it over to them, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Patrick. Mayor, members of council, members of the URA, Tim and I are happy to be here tonight to share some of our analysis and the way we have looked at the project and make that analysis transparent to you to ultimately form a good, solid decision. By way of just a little background on economic and planning systems, full-service land use economics consulting firm. We cover the western part of the country with our offices in Los Angeles, Oakland, Sacramento, and Denver. Some of our areas of expertise, market analysis, fiscal modeling, public finance, P3 structuring. Basically, it's the intersection of real estate in terms of the public and the private sectors, and whether you're looking at it from a fiscal perspective or a terms of a P3 or market support, what have you, these are all of the lenses that we have practice areas in, and we're bringing all of that to bear on the Clear Creek Crossing project. The memo that you have in your packet tonight gives a background on the project. If you look at attachment 1, this is the memo from EPS, and page 2 gives a breakdown of the size of the project in terms of all of the different uses and the total square footage. Just under 200,000 square feet of retail floor area, 300 apartment units, and 200 hotel rooms. Page 3 has the map, the site plan of what the project will look like. Page 4 has costs, $40 million of hard costs. The $40 million include $10 million for the hook ramps. It does not include about $10 million of soft costs. So total project costs are about 50. And as with everything, you have to think about what's in the mix. We generally like to think of it as a $40 million project plus $10 million for the hook ramps. And then finally, as all of the different revenue sources, public and private, that Patrick mentioned are delineated on the bottom of page 6. And that is the basis for the analysis, are those givens. Something we just want to touch on, and I'm going to keep our comments to probably 5-7 minutes, so I'm not going to talk all night, but I do want to convey as much as we can of the analysis that we've done. Some of the goals we have, just to start those off, project viability for the developer with construction in the near term, expansion of employment opportunities in Wheat Ridge, expansion of the economy and the city's fiscal base, and a fair contribution from both the public and private sectors. And ultimately, that last goal is the crux of the issue. What's fair for the developer? What's fair for the community? And that's what we're grappling with. Patrick mentioned that the specific terms have yet to be determined, and that is true. There's a lot of moving pieces, and we're working with the development team even now to research some of them and figure out how to get them all in line. Ultimately, we have 3 criteria that we will be evaluating and bringing back to you. The first is but for. The project will not happen but for the role of public financing. The second is eligibility in terms of the application of the funds. That's not an issue. There's plenty of eligible expenses on the site. And the third is a proportional division of proceeds. And these criteria are not set in stone. The but for is ultimately driven around developer return. The project won't proceed but for the role of public financing to help the developer achieve a reasonable return, industry standard level of return. There's a little bit of give and take in terms of what's a reasonable return. Similarly, proportional division of proceeds, what's fair? How much should the community get? How much should the developer get? So those are the 2 primary criteria that we keep coming back to. Tonight what you have is essentially the first half of the analysis. It's the frame up of the entire project, what the funds are, how the revenues come in, how the revenues go out. EPS has built a fairly complicated model. We can test any number of hypothetical scenarios, and really it's in developing those scenarios that we can identify which one makes the most sense. The 3 variables that we are focusing on right now to try to close this in and get some reasonable distribution, reasonable proportionality all the way around. 1, use tax. 2, property values used to generate the URA revenues. And 3, internal property sales. Some of these factors drive gap closure within the developer's pro forma. Some drive the composition of the revenues needed for debt service. So as you can tell, there's a lot of moving pieces. What we want to do tonight is check in with council and the URA board and find out a little bit more about the priority that this project is for the community. What are the community benefits that you identify in it, and how hard do you want to fight to make it happen? EPS, I'll just close with these last 30 seconds worth of insight, and then we can open it up for your questions and comments. EPS does have questions at this point. We think that the ask from the developer is a bit high and a bit higher than normal. At this point in time, there is if the project is identified as a $40 million project, half come from the bond proceeds at $20 million. 50% is a little larger than most developers need of public financing. Now keep in mind that the bond composition About 1/3 of those dollars come from the developer's prerogative, a Metro District, additive PIFs, things that he's doing that create a greater burden, but nonetheless he thinks he can market. 2/3 of that bond come from public money. So is that proportionality reasonable? The other is the duration of the time. Many times duration within URA deals, 10 years, 15 years. This is 30 years, so this is the full duration of the bond. So those are two things of specific issue. Our goal is to alleviate pressure on the credit PIF, PIFs, between the sales tax, lodging tax, admission tax. How do you alleviate pressure on the credit PIFs, and how do you leave some resources for the URA within the property tax revenues that would be generated over time? These two revenue sources are what give resources to the city and the URA to fulfill other things in their mission. The developer has been very clear that he needs a $20 million bond, and in our conversations is made it, I don't know how else to say it, but very clear that that's the goal. So I think at this point in time, it would be very helpful for us to hear in terms of your perspective on the deal, and with that, we can go back to the developer and start to get some resolution in terms of the different funding sources, revenue sources, and how the different pieces come together.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Pardon me. Mr. Rogers, do you have anything that you wanted? We've got a joint meeting with the URA board. Is there any kind of opening statement, or do we want to throw it over for open questions? Or and please grab a mic.
My initial perspective is that the description of the work that the bond council is doing is consistent with the work you've done on prior projects. So strategically, I think we are aligned with the path you've taken. We haven't seen your presentation packet that you had for tonight's meeting, so I can't specifically address any of the math that you're proposing here, nor would I even have the ability to if I saw it. I mean, it's over my pay grade. That's why we hire you.
Fair enough.
So strategically, personally, I feel comfortable with the way you're attacking the problem. I'm anxious to see how those numbers roll out and how you advise us to address those allocations. It's a big project, and I'm glad you're on board to help us with that guidance.
Thank you. Okay, well, with that, I will throw it up to questions from council. Ms. Dozeman.
So are we able to kind of work with the duration? Because that was one of my main concerns, is that there's no sunset at a certain amount gained. Like, why is there no sunset? Why would it be the full 30 years?
Well, that's based on the bonding need and capacities and how long it takes to pay off a $20 million loan, basically. And those are some factors that I think we can work on. As Andrew mentioned, I think the developer is pretty adamant that he thinks $20 million is the number he needs, but he's also very understanding and cooperative to work with us to get the share backs down as much as possible, as low as possible. I don't know if that means it would shorten duration of time or not, but a lot of that has to do with how the bonds are issued. And the meeting we have on Thursday is with the bond counsel that Evergreen is using, and they have a lot of conditions and parameters that they have to consider when they're planning to issue these bonds. Are they going to get sold with certain assumptions? And these guys can maybe speak to that a little bit more too. So I think there's some movement maybe on how the bonds get issued, and how aggressive their bond counsel wants to get. Our initial conversations with their bond counsel is they're afraid to get too aggressive, meaning they're afraid to overestimate what the value of the land sales are going to be, or what the value or what the sales tax are going to come back. They're feeling that there could be a recession in the next in our near future, in the next 5 years or so, which will have an impact on a lot of those things. To answer your question, the length of time I think is all based on how we structure the bonds, and maybe Andrew or Tim could speak to that. And specifically, I'm sorry, specifically to the property tax. Property tax TIF, state statute allows a urban renewal authority to capture property tax increment up to 25 years. The city of Wheat Ridge has already started the TIF clock on all of our urban renewal areas as of December 2015, so that clock is already ticking. So the property tax increment will only be good for about 22 years if this is approved. The 30 years is associated with all the city taxes that they're asking for.
I guess just to add on, that is the crux of the issue, is that length of time, and requesting either 100% of the remainder of the TIF or 100% of the balance of the duration of the bond itself, which is 30 years, is quite a bit. Now, do you want to front load it such that greater revenues are made available to the developer to service that debt, such that the bond could be completed in a shorter time frame? Or in fact, do you want to reduce the amount of revenues and not worry about the length of time? You know, that's some of the trade-offs. And the longer the time period, the greater the risk. Retail is a changing world, and retail 30 years from now may look different than it does today. And so in some ways, if you're going to focus on something, I think the length of time is, that's a shared risk on both parties. The short-term revenues are a sure bet, a better bet, and perhaps where the community should focus.
And we didn't speak to specifically what the developer is asking for, what percentages, and if you read your report, you'll see it in there. But what they're asking for, again, this isn't nothing we've agreed to. We're still talking about this, but they asked for 1.5% of our 3.5% sales tax. So, Leah, to your question, to sunsetting, the city would, if you approve this deal as is, the city would get 1.5% of its sales tax on day one. The other 1.5 wouldn't come back until 30 years, or when the bonds are paid off. For some reason, if the project does much better than anticipated, the bonds could be paid off sooner. But there's also, at this point, there's a trigger in our public finance agreement, our draft agreement, that anything above debt service payments on an annual basis, the city also can capture. So I haven't figured out the actual number yet, but the actual effective rate of what the city's sharing should be lower than 1.5, because they do project that on an annual basis there will be more revenue than is needed to pay the debt service. So we're still working on those numbers, and when we come back on June 4th, hopefully we can give you those numbers of what that looks like, what the city could potentially see on an annual basis, because all the money's not going to the developer. At least half of it the city is keeping. The lodger's tax is the same. They're asking for half, 5% of the 10%. The admissions tax, they're asking for 2.5 of the 4%, and that's it. And then use tax, I think they're asking for 50% of the use tax. But again, that's just what the developer's asking for. We haven't agreed to anything at this point.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Like the other Tim, I'm not sure I understand this, but help me understand this. Is it correct that you're projecting $48.3 million over 30 years as the city's portion, which would net out to $1.6 million per year? These are assumptions based on your assumptions, so this is really iffy. But is that where we are with this proposal as it stands?
Yeah, so you're on table 6?
Yep. Page
10.
Page 20 of your complete packet, page 10 of the EPS memo.
Yes, thank you.
Table 6.
And so and what we have, and I'll try to verbalize it for the URA board, we have a series of revenues to the city, revenues to the URA, and then revenues to the developer. So 3 categories. And we've got 2 columns. We've got on the left side, we've got the developer baseline inputs, and then we've got on the right side of the second column, which is an EPS set of inputs that we think is more consistent with market conditions today. And so your question was trying to clarify the revenue flows. And if you said, for example, the developer, under the terms that they're proposing, 41.9 million would flow to the city, and 38 million would flow to the project. with another 18 million flowing to the project from the additive PIF and Metro District. Do you want to clarify into that?
No.
So yeah, Tim, you were correct in your statement.
Ms. Davis.
So, I think as a city, we all know this project is important, and I think all of us with historical background know that part of the number crunching and the, pulling both sides is kind of what happened with the Cabela's, and they couldn't come to an agreement, and then management changed with Cabela's. But I do think that as a council, it's going to be important, and I know that this is something that Patrick and staff is working on, that, because we've even talked as a council, his quote, even the developer's quote, is he's building a new city over there, or a little city over there. And, with a little city comes city expenses, and we've talked about police presence over there. We've talked about, there's going to have to be roads that need to be plowed and all of those repaired, and especially if we're talking 30 years, holy cow, this isn't just like 5 years and then let's talk about who's going to repair the roads. This is 30 years. So, and I appreciate the work of the bond council group, and I also appreciate, because also as a part of urban renewal, they have a group that also looks at the costs and what's fair, and making sure that, again, the private sector is putting in what they need to, and the public sector is putting in what they need to. So I'm happy we have those third-party experts, because I'm a pretty good math person, and this is above my pay grade too. So thank you for that. But I think as a city, we need to put that in consideration. But I think this project is really important. I just want to share a quick story. I was at Orange Theory this morning at 5 in the morning, and Orange Theory happens to be right in front of Hacienda Colorado site, and people were talking about it. And the comment was, and again, that's a project that the Renewal Wheat Ridge is doing, and the city's helping with some undergrounding and that type of thing. And it was funny to hear the conversation, because people said, there's nowhere to eat around here, there's nowhere to go. And they said, so it's nice that we'll have someplace. And then someone mentioned a Brewski's, which is now in Lakewood. And then they said, well, if we go anywhere, we have to go up to the mills. And so this was a big conversation of a group of people. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I do think that there's a lot of benefit for this development across the way. But I do think we need to find a middle ground, because I think the developer also needs to understand that he is building a new little city, and new little cities also require costs from a city perspective. And I'm not sure that 52% and a 48% split is going to cover that little city. But I think that's, again, what we need the experts to help us with. But I do think it's an important project, and I do want to move forward and be as creative as possible, but also fair to our taxpayers and to our developer, because it is something that we need to move forward on.
Christy made some good points, and just to clarify, so council and the public understands, the public infrastructure that will be dedicated to the city is Clear Creek Drive, which goes from 32nd all the way up to the creek, then the extension that goes to the 40th underpass. So those will have to be maintained and managed by the city. And then, the police chief's here. We've been talking about what all these new developments are going to have, what impact they're going to have on the police department, not just this development in itself, but the TOD side, and just the natural increases in traffic and activity in Wheat Ridge is having an impact on our police department. So there definitely will be some city expenses, which we're trying to calculate what those potentially would look like.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
Just to clarify a little more, because I don't really understand the relationship of the Urban Renewal Authority here. So of the 1.6 million, how much of that is going to go to urban renewal and how much is going to actually fill city coffers?
The 1.6 million is what you calculated from the 48
Right.
million. That does not include, that's city revenues. That does not include the property tax. So that's just, those are revenues from our sales tax, our admissions tax, and our accommodation tax. And then any project rebates to the city, those rebates that I talked about earlier, that any monies above the debt service that's required on an annual basis, that totals the 48 million.
Just to clarify, Patrick, if we're looking at table 6, we are including property tax revenues, incremental property tax revenues that are zero in that, yeah. But they are being shared with the project.
Yeah, no, they're being shared, but of the 48 million, it doesn't include property tax.
Additional questions, comments? Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So as I understand it, the 75,278,000, that is the revenue needed to run the debt service on the $25 million bond, is that?
Correct.
Correct.
Those nominal dollars collected over that 30-year period then support a $25 million bond.
Okay. And then, so that's, that $75 million amount is in addition to the 10 million that we provided for the hook ramps and those numbers. So the 25 million that, let's say he's going to get the 25 million for the bond, and the 10 million, that's 35 million. The total infrastructure project costs are 40 million. So where does that extra 5 come in?
Well, that's either the developer arranges for debt or equity investors and brings that money to the table himself.
And so I guess the other question, so along those lines, this is looking at just the infrastructure costs. What is the total project development cost as it relates to this $40 million project?
Sure. So the $40 million will cover all the horizontal expenditures. And then at that point, the developer is good, because this developer is a horizontal developer. And this is just the way some people describe it, as the tallest thing a horizontal developer builds is a fire hydrant.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then they sell the pads and sell the lots. They'll, work with a hotel developer on the hotel pads, residential, all the way down the line, and then turn it over as quickly as possible to these individual specialists, if you will, to go vertical. And so the vertical isn't part of any of the analysis, just horizontal.
And I guess then what is the developer's skin in the game on this?
That's the crux. And the but-for analysis that we will generate, that'll be the second part of this memo, is public financing is required, but for public financing, the project isn't viable. How much public financing is needed to get the developer into a reasonable rate of return? A $20 million bond does that. In this scenario, we ran it based on what we think are more accurate market inputs, and actually generates a surplus, which enables the community to either shorten the time frame, redirect some of the revenues to the URA, or reduce the credit PIF. There's some latitude in that, and it kind of depends on what the priorities are. Now, here again, we also know that the developer is saying, this project doesn't pencil without a minimum of $20 million. So all this to say that the way you're framing this up is accurate in terms of the way we built the model and are evaluating the deal. And so it's just a question of how much skin should the developer come to the table with?
Right. I guess is it that difference between the 35 and the 40, or is it, is there a set percentage that they should be bringing to the table for this, or?
That is a good question. And the classic rule of thumb, if a developer is building an apartment building, developer will get 25% of total project costs as equity, 75% of total project costs as debt. Equity comes with a requirement of about a 20% return. Debt, historically, 7.5%. And then you have your average weighted cost of capital, and you test the revenues, and you get a sufficient NOI to service the debt and provide a return to equity. That's real estate economics in a nutshell. Mm-hmm. On deals like this, how much should the developer bring to the table is the crux of the issue. And how much does the developer rely on the bond and some of the other public financing sources? And how much is he bringing to the table in the form of his own debt and equity?
Okay, and I guess just in general, my comments on this are that not only do we have this coming and going, it's not just within the city of Wheat Ridge's taxing structure that this is being built on, it's also within the Longs Peak Metro District that we see the addition of fees and other costs associated with that. So we're not just looking at what the city is doing, it's also with what the Longs Peak Metro District is doing. And to me, it just seems a little too rich as far as the amount, the ask that's being asked at the present time, that in its current format, I don't think I can support it, but I do understand that this isn't going to be done by itself. It needs some sort of support, but it is somewhat concerning the amount of different fees. And if you were to look at a receipt coming out of this development, you're going to have two different PIFs, TIF, and God knows what else is going to be out of, even the property tax element on there as well. So that's my concern, is that there's just too much coming and going on this, and we need to figure out a better way to do that, and I don't know what that is.
Mr. Matthews?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I got a bunch of questions. The way I understand it, the Metropolitan District has been used as a financing go-between or middle manager or whatever to facilitate financing for these projects. As a bunch of this infrastructure gets constructed, what role and how do we move the Metro District out of the picture?
Well, the Metro District has many authorities under state statute. There's a whole list of them, and the primary one is, to bond and build infrastructure. So in this case, the Longs Peak Metropolitan District will be the bonding authority. They'll be issuing the debt. I think the deal terms at this point is the district will probably stay in place for at least 40 years, which is typical. Metropolitan districts stay around 30. I think 40 is it 30 is what they said the other night? 30 to 40? I can't, somewhere 30 to 40 is what they're proposing will stay. The Metropolitan District stays in place even after the debt is paid off to manage and operate and maintain the project. They'll manage and maintain all of the public in the sense that it's Metro District property, not city property. They'll maintain all the landscaping and plazas and any and parking lots that belong to within the district area. So they'll have in addition to the mill that is, they're going to dedicate it towards debt service, which is 55 mil. They would have I think they were saying 5, right? A 5 mil for operations and maintenance of the Metropolitan District themselves.
Who's going to plow snow?
Who's what?
Who's going to plow snow, just for an example? For the next 30 years, who's going to plow snow out
The city will plow snow on Clear Creek Drive and the extension to 40th Underpass. The Longs Peak Metropolitan District will plow snow on all of the parking lots and all the private areas that don't belong to the city or to any other public agency. CDOT will do the hook ramps.
Okay, when you say all the private areas, but if these private areas have been purchased and built by some other entity, then why is the Metro District?
Because they'll be
let's say it's a parking lot.
They'll be part of the Metro District, and they'll be paying into that property tax. They'll be paying that property tax to have their parking lots plowed.
Like an HOA.
Just like an HOA, but we were talking about another one yesterday.
That's the part that concerns me, is these Metro Districts just are like trying to get rid of fleas. I mean, they just hang out there forever collecting a fee, and I'm not sure I see the value added that they're out there plowing a parking lot.
Well, the fee is on those property owners only that are within that district. The property tax mill levy is only on those property owners. So, and they know that if a tenant's going to come in there, they know that up front, that you're gonna have this extra mill on your property, and this is what you get for it.
If you're interested in talking about the Metro District a little bit more, two things. One, a developer is going to charge triple nets to all of their tenants to be able to cover maintenance, all of the upkeep. And as part of the triple nets over time have been taxes and common area maintenance and utilities, those types of things. Now, over time, the triple net, that phrase has stuck, but the number of things that the landlord covers is proliferated and is numerous. The landlord can either charge that as part of the lease as common area maintenance, or can charge that as part of the lease, as part of the property tax that funds the Metro District. Either way, tenants are paying for their services. So it's that in and of itself, I don't think should be a deficit to the project. The larger challenge is that the Metro District is the conduit to issue the debt. And the revenue streams that flow to the Metro District, some are from the community, like property tax that the URA will commit to the Metro District, and some are of the developer's initiation, such as the mills or the additive PIF. They all get combined to service the debt. If there's something I think that is worth focusing on, it's the composition of the revenue streams. I don't know if that helps any, but...
A little bit. Is there going to be any language in these agreements that if the bonds are paid off in 15 years, that the TIF, the PIF, the whatever goes away?
Yeah, it'll be...
And I don't mean it goes away and goes over to the URA coffers, I mean ends.
No, there'll be language in differently for that. Again, the property tax will be specific to the urban renewal authority, so they'll negotiate how that happens. But all the city fees, the sales tax, and all the lodger's tax and the emissions tax, yes, it's either or. So it's when the bonds are paid off or a certain time frame. So yeah, if this project does wildly successful and is much better than projected, we could pay off the bonds, or as Andrew mentioned earlier, this excess revenue that comes in on an annual basis that's above debt service for that year, the city, what we're writing into the agreement is the city gets to decide how to use that. It's either it goes to pay off the bonds earlier, or the city gets the money for our annual debt or general fund budget, or if something comes up, a new development comes in that might need a parking garage out there, it's like, oh, we don't have enough money, let's put that extra money towards a parking garage for whatever. So there'll be some options for the city to decide how to use excess revenues.
What is the warranty period on these infrastructures that they build?
You mean, like Clear Creek, what's going to be dedicated to the city? What'd you say?
2 years.
2 years?
Standard. 2-year warranty.
I'll yield the floor for a minute. Someone else has some questions.
Patrick, I could offer
more.
a practical perspective on covenant-controlled business parks, having lived in that world for quite a while, Mr. Matthews. From a buyer or a seller's perspective, or a tenant's perspective in a covenant-controlled business park, and a good example might not be too far away in Coors Technology Center, a covenant-controlled business park. And when you compare Coors Technology Center, which is a covenant-controlled business park with a Metro District and Architectural Control Committee, and compare that to our 44th Industrial Park nearby, the quality of the product, the predictability of the quality of the product, they're vastly different. So for the Urban Renewal Authority to look at the risk factor associated with a development of this size that wouldn't have an architectural control committee or an overlying authority that would control the quality of the tenants and maintain that quality, it increased the risk in terms of the value of the property and the ability of the developers to attract and retain those top-notch tenants. There's a marketable difference between covenant-controlled business parks and those that are not.
And how does that relate then to our city rules and regulations and codes? I mean, are they going to be subject to us, or is this Metro District not going to control codes for that portion of the project that they own?
Oh, no, all architectural standards, all building code are still the authority of the city. The Metro District does not have those authorities.
HOAs, they will have some authority
Yeah.
internally, maybe to control some of the activities that happen within that.
Sure.
that
What's in
authority.
the service plan? But this project has a vision plan and a design pattern book that, we're going to establish an architectural control committee that will make sure that all the development is meeting the standards that have been outlined in that vision document.
And that's really cool. I mean, that's a real benefit to the developer and I think to the community and to the investors. Without that, you've got more risk. It's not defined.
Thank you. Ms. Davis and Ms. Duran on deck.
So I just have a comment and then a question. I'll start with my question. So as I'm still looking at this page 6, I think it's, table 6. So they have the project revenues, and I know these are all just penciled in and might change. They have the project revenues and they have the PIF, and which ranges significantly from a merchandise PIF 1.5% all the way to accommodation credit PIF of 5%. But then underneath it, it says developer election, and then it has a general merchandise tax add-on of 0.5%. So what does that mean?
Yes. So it means that the middle bundle are revenues that would otherwise go to the city that the developer's redirecting to the project. The bottom third, the developer election, are the mechanisms the developer is choosing to create that are on top of the existing taxation structure. And so it's, the middle is redirecting and the lower is adding.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, that means that, so as a tax, as I go and shop there, then it would show an extra 0.5% PIF.
Correct.
If I'm shopping there, or if I'm going to the movie there, it'll show an extra 0.5% PIF.
Yes, it will.
Yeah, okay.
On your ticket, yeah.
Okay, and then I just wanted to make, based off of some of the presentation from at the Urban Renewal Wheat Ridge meeting, one of the things that also was appealing with the Metro District, and I think the developer was trying to be cognizant of this, to make sure a lot of that money goes into, structures and that type of thing, but also programming. So like he put in a good example using like Stapleton, and how in some of those, Stapleton has those types of districts, but that extra little bit of perhaps, I forget what they call it, like planning monies or whatever it might be, it allows them to have a concert in the park. And, to create some programming within that little city that would also draw, neighbors and our community there. So it would be providing additional events, if it be, and I'm not saying this is the case because I know the city already has an Easter egg hunt, but let's pretend a shamrock hunt or something, who knows? But it would be other events that the city could participate in, or our city, our community, if it be concerts in the park and things like that, just one, to draw people to that area, but also, to build that community. So I know that was some of the funds being, kind of being slated in the Metro District.
Thank you. Ms. Duran?
I have more of a comment. I know this is a heavy lift for everyone, for all stakeholders, but it's necessary. I mean, we have an opportunity here. We've never had a development like this in the city, and I think we have a huge opportunity. I just want us to be mindful of our community, which I think we will, moving forward with conversation. But I'm excited about this. I'm excited about seeing what can transpire. You were mentioning, Christy, about, it's building community, really. It's something that's not over on that part of Wheat Ridge. And I think this is, like I said, a great opportunity. It is a heavy lift. A lot of stakeholders are going to be investing in this, and we're communicating and keeping the doors and channels open, and I'm going to rely on you to do the best you can for us moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Dozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So while I recognize that this is probably one of the most important developments to the future of our community, I'm having a really hard time reconciling and justifying the fact that we are placing 50% of the finance burden on the public when we literally just sold ourselves short by allowing for the main employment anchor to be a nonprofit organization that is not going to be a sales tax generating entity. So we are asking to the public to give 50% of that funds when we just allowed for them to do a major employment anchor when a lot of us thought that that was going to be retail. So I'm having a really difficult time with this, and I hope that the numbers can be wiggled around a little bit.
Thank you. Ms. Davis?
So just an add to that, because that came up at the renewal meeting, and that anchor, because of the property tax situation and some of the revenues that won't be seen there, they are building in that anchor is paying money into the development. So that was a discussion in urban renewal, actually. So that anchor, although might not be generating that revenue, they're paying it themselves.
So is that going to be reflected in the numbers?
It's reflected in the actual horizontal construction costs. They're paying for a lot of the site costs for their project, which would normally be in the construction costs. So it does lower that. I don't have that number in my head. Do you guys remember what that number was?
I think it's about $8.5 million in costs, and we will account for that when we do the but-for and evaluate developer returns.
So I think kind of, so basically for the story is that not-for-profit anchor is paying for their own horizontal costs.
Yeah, it's not gonna, it will not total what, maybe a large box retail would bring in over 30 years, but, you know, I think all of us would have enjoyed more retail out there, but there's certain realities today, unfortunately, that there's just not that much retail out there. The developer is in Vegas right now, meeting with many different tenants and trying to get the best retail on the site that's going to generate as much sales tax as possible. To put this perspective in a little bit, or this project in a little bit perspective, the last developer that brought a deal to the city back in 2012, 2013, you know, I think there was much more retail in it at that point, but that was, you know, a different time. They were asking for 2.25 of the city's 3% for basically 40 years, under a lot of speculative conditions that the property north of the creek was going to develop, which we had no guarantees that was going to happen. So this may not be you may not think this is the best deal yet. We don't either. I think hopefully we can get this to be a better deal, but the last deal we got was much worse.
Mr. Newton, I want to say a few things. Thank you for bringing this. I'm really excited about this project. I think it has a lot of good things for Wheat Ridge. I'm also concerned about what your summary of project costs on page 4 on table 2, and we're down at the bottom in the printed part, and it's 40 million, and you said that really it's 50 million. So we're 25% over the budget right there. When I look at the phase 1, the 2E funds, at a total cost of 15 million, and we've allocated 10 million on that, so we're 50% over budget on that. We've already got about a 9% contingency, design and construction contingency built in. We've got a contractor's general conditions and fee at about 16% of his costs. How solid do you think these numbers are?
The developer does have cost estimates from, who's the contractor?
Mortensen.
Mortensen. They're very current. I would say, and costs these days are a moving target. Labor is basically impossible to find, and materials are also not going down any. So these costs are tough to pin down. I think the Mortensen estimates are weeks old. So I think that they're actually fairly comprehensive, and, you know,
and where do we go from 40 million to 50 million when you said that we're really 50 million in this
soft
case?
Costs, and perhaps there's a better way that EPS can depict the costs in the tables, because I think that might be.
So what kind of soft costs are you talking about?
Oh, all the attorneys, designers, civil engineers, surveyors, you know, anyone who's providing a service, that's $10 million of cost that is not shown in the table. Now, what is a little confusing is that we have another $10 million cost, and that's 2E monies for the hook ramps. And it kind of depends on what you want to include and what you don't want to include. Yes, and they are shown in Table 2. So whether 2E funds should be exempt and taken out, which they probably should, as just a standalone to create a developable site, then once the city has accomplished that, then you look at the balance of what's going on, and there's about $30 million in hard costs and about another $10 million in soft costs that total 40. And I apologize, we will do a better job in terms of clarifying where 2E fits into the picture and where how the hard and the soft come together.
Okay, so we'll be able to look at a real cost.
Yes.
Pro forma. Will we be looking at the developer's pro forma?
The developer has submitted a pro forma. EPS has built one that is also, it's independent, and if you'd like to see that, we can certainly provide it.
I'd love to see the developer's pro forma.
Okay. We can certainly do that.
And as I mentioned, the hook ramps, they're showing 15 million here because that was the last estimate they got from Mortensen. But as I mentioned, the bids just came in last week. I haven't seen them yet, so hopefully we'll have an update for you at our next meeting on what those numbers came in at. So hopefully that's lower than 15 million.
Hopefully. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess as it relates to the hook ramps, and my understanding is we've already signed that agreement relative to the hook ramps with the developer. And one of my concerns there is that it says that we're on the hook for whatever it is in addition to the 10 million. And at the same time, they're coming to us asking us for public assistance. So is there some way to work that so that we're not on the hook for that additional, but they could be worked into the agreement?
We're on the hook until they issue bonds and they can repay us back. So they don't have the cash right now until they can issue the bonds. So as soon as they issue the bonds, that was one of the agreements we approved, the reimbursement agreement. They'll reimburse the city for anything over 10 million.
And then
that will be cooked into the deal, though.
Sure. So with the PIF arrangement and the city being the collector of that PIF, it looks like a tax, it's collected like a tax, but it's a fee. So to me, it just doesn't make sense that we as a city are the collector agency. And I understand it's been done in other deals, but when a government agency is collecting money from a citizen, it feels like a tax. And so is there any other entity, a law firm or something else that could administer that, or why is it the city is being asked to be?
Yeah, there's different ways to do that. We just thought the city, there won't be that many tenants to collect from, so it won't be a huge impact on the city. We'll get paid to do it. We should get about $50,000 a year, I think is what the fee is. And it just efficient. It makes sense. I understand what you're saying with the differentiation between tax and fee, but we're already collecting the sales tax from these vendors. All they have to do is, we want to make it easy on the vendors so that they can submit their PIF revenues and their sales tax revenues to the city, then it's done. It seems easier and more efficient.
I get that that's the way that it seems, but when you go out of your way to call something a PIF so that it isn't a tax, and then you turn back around and it's the same agency, the same government entity collecting both of them, what's the difference? Why not call it a tax? It's just...
Well, we collect a lot of fees from a lot of people, too.
So.
Mr. Matthews.
If I remember correctly, Mortensen's acting kind of as the construction manager on this, and they're going to be putting this stuff out for bid, is that correct? And not the developer himself? And how does Long's Peak fit into that picture? I mean, who's controlling Mortensen? The developer?
Yes.
Long's Peak? But if the developer's controlling Long's Peak, but we're doing utilities that are going to belong to Long's Peak, how do they get, what's the chain of command in this thing?
The developer is essentially Long's Peak also. The Long's Peak is made up of Evergreen and Coors. There's 5 seats on the Metro District Board. Evergreen has 3, Coors has 2. So Long's Peak is managing the process of constructing the hook ramps. We have an agreement with them to do that. They're using Mortensen as the developer to do it.
And so Mortensen's a kind of stick and brick guy.
Mortensen did the bidding. We bid out the hook ramps, so we're not sure who's going to build the hook ramps.
Yeah. And how about all the rest of this? So is that all going to go as one package? All the streets, all the curb and gutter, all the trails, or are they going to piecemeal it? Do we know?
I don't know if they've gotten that far down. Most of the infrastructure, again, the Clear Creek Drive, the hook ramps, the extension, those will probably all be done by the same folks, but obviously when it comes to utilities, and there are going to be different contractors out there for that, but Evergreen will be managing that bidding process and that work.
Additional questions, Mr. Urban?
To Councilmember Matthews' point, my understanding is at present time, you have the city contracting with AECom that is being the owner's representative to the Longs Peak Metro District, which is then contracting with the developer, and now the developer's contracting with Mortensen to then bid out the hook ramp construction?
AECom is not working for the district, they're working for the city as the city's rep.
Right, that's what I meant. They're the owner's representative working with the Metro District, and the Metro District is then working with the developer, and the developer is then contracting with Mortensen, and Mortensen's then going to hire a constructor of the hook ramps, or how does Mortensen fit into that?
Yeah, Mortensen did the bidding package for us and the estimating and the construction documents, and they put out the bid process, so, yep.
Thank you.
Mr. Matthews?
I'm curious, Morton's a stick and brick guy. Why didn't we get a highway contractor to bid utilities? I mean, which normally comes under highway heavy utility, the utilities, the dirt work, what have you. Why are we ending up with a stick and brick guy managing that portion of it, since all of the individual tenants, all of the vertical work is going to be done by the individual tenants? Why wouldn't we go to, and I'm just throwing out names, but an Ames or Kiewit or what have you, that there are in the dirt / highway heavy business?
Mortensen's been involved in this project for many years. They were working with Cabela's at the time, so this developer decided to stick with them. They had a lot of the history on the project. They had a lot of the plans in place for the hook ramp, so they kept using them.
Who's the watchdog? Who's keeping track of all these numbers and making sure that we don't end up paying $80 million for something that should have cost 50?
We all are. That's why we hired EPS. That's why we're bringing this to you tonight. We're vetting these numbers as we do in every project, and making sure that it's a fair deal for both the city and the developer.
The agreements can stipulate these numeric parameters, and then the metro districts by law have an annual audit, and that annual audit is done by a third-party accounting firm. And they can verify that some of these milestones that we establish here from the terms of this deal are in fact complied with.
I'm just concerned. I recently read an article, and I think I passed it out to all the council members, that, and this 3 months ago, for me that's a lifetime ago memory-wise, for that big resort development, what have you, out in Aurora, and they had $86 million in TIF, and then an independent, I'm looking for the right word, an independent auditor came in later and said they really should have only gotten $56 million. And that's where I'm heading to, because I know there may have been vertical work in there as well as the horizontal, but how are we protecting ourselves to make sure that doesn't happen to Wheat Ridge?
Well, and I think if I can weigh in on the Gaylord, they were one of the city of Aurora tapped not only city funds and city URA funds, but also state funds through a special program the state offered, rebating a portion of state sales tax for net new visitation activity. And the net new is a simple phrase, very complicated way to define it. And I think there were different opinions in terms of what was net new. None of that, we're not tapping into any state funds here. None of that applies here. And I think that what we do agree to is going to be simpler, and whatever the agreement that we collectively hammer out can be codified in a way that's simple and much easier than the Gaylord, because we don't have the state involved. So that in and of itself, we can put some measures in to ensure that there's some checks and balances in terms of expenditure.
And through the city's annual financial audit too, our independent auditors will be looking very closely at deals like this. And they'll see all the revenue sources that come in and how they go out for this project, and making sure that they'll have a copy of the public finance agreement, and if they see anything that's funny, they'll bring it to our attention.
And I have one question for URA. At the end of the day, and after you've paid off any bonds or whatever that you guys are guaranteeing, what ends up being your excess revenue that you are predicting will remain in your coffers?
We haven't seen those numbers yet. We're waiting for those analysis from the pro formas and.
Do we have a ballpark?
Well, for this project, the developer currently is asking for 100% of the property tax increment. So unless
Again, if that's paid off in less than 30 years, do we have an idea?
We do. We have those numbers. Yeah. It has to be over in 22 years. Tim, can you pull up those numbers fairly quickly?
The developer's asking for all of the property tax increment for the duration.
But he's asking after that, how much property tax is generated.
Then the URA will have sunsetted.
Yeah, the URA said, well, the city, yeah, but then all the taxing districts that are in that area will get revenues. So I don't know if we have those broken down or what the total number is. Maybe the city's portion is very small. There's like 90 mills out there. The city's portion is 1.830 of that. So the city's not going to get much, but the school district, fire district, the county, and they'll start getting their monies back.
And are we following the new rules where they have representatives on the URA board?
We are, and that hasn't been triggered for the city of Wheat Ridge yet. That's only triggered if there's an amendment, a substantial amendment to an urban renewal plan, and that hasn't happened. So
Or a new plan.
Or a new plan adopted, and
So that's why whether it was my council or previous that rushed this through on before the law changed, there was this.
We did.
That's why the clock is ticking now.
Yes.
Okay.
The clock is ticking on this meeting, too, so let's, are there additional questions? We've had a pretty robust discussion. Well, I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for coming.
Thank you.
We look forward, we have then, our next look at this is for first reading on the 11th of June.
June 4th study session.
Oh, June 4th study session, okay. And then it will be coming fast and furious after that. Thank you very much, appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much for inviting the Renewal Authority.
Okay, well, thank you
This
very
was
much
great
for
to have
coming.
this-
Appreciate
this
your
interface
help
with
on
you
this.
folks. It really was. It's very helpful to us to know what our bosses are talking about.
You're our bosses.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. We're going to reconvene now on agenda item number 4. This is opioid litigation. Mr. Goff, do you want to introduce this topic?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I briefed you very briefly on this a couple times, and the consensus was to bring this back to a study session to have a little bit more discussion about it before you made a final decision. And we've brought attorneys from Spites and Warwick, who are representing Arvada and other communities in Colorado on the national opioid litigation. Put just a very amount of brief information in your memo. They can answer any questions you have. There's a lot of things. There are some things questions they probably won't be able to answer because it's a pending litigation. But we'll just maybe open it up and let them present. Is that okay?
Terrific. So if you gentlemen would introduce yourself and then give us a little overview on the litigation.
There we go. Are we on? First of all, I want to say thank you, Mayor Starker, and to the council for letting us come and present. My name is Andrew Newcomb, and this is Sam Mitchell. I'll let him do talking for himself. But we are with the firm of Spites and Warwick, which is a Denver law firm. We're in Denver, Colorado. And we are representing a number of Colorado entities in the national opioid litigation, which is currently a large multi-district litigation lawsuit that has members across the nation, including states, individual cities, county level, municipalities as well. We currently represent 6 counties, I believe, 5 counties and 2 cities. And we're here to talk to you about whatever questions you have, no matter how high level or in depth about any particular topic on the subject. I'll tell you right on the front end, there are almost every single state is either involved at a major city level or state level. Colorado is currently not taking any action at the state level, and so individual cities and counties are retaining counsel, our firm, as well as 1 or 2 other firms to advance their interests in the litigation. And that's where we are in terms of that opioid impact. I'm certain if you're talking to your constituency, you know that it's a tremendous impact across the state, certainly in the metro area. And everyone we've talked to has a personal story or is at least 1 degree of separation away from someone who has a story about overdosing on opioids as well as heroin, which is secondary to becoming addicted to opioids. So it's a problem across the nation, and it's an issue that is coming to a head in litigation as early as next year in March of 2019. So we can just open it up to specific questions. That way we can kind of direct this and make it move a little faster.
Counselors? Ms. Duran.
Can you tell me what the litigation is exactly?
Sure.
So currently, there are over 500 lawsuits filed across the nation against the manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacies of opioid narcotics. The manufacturer... Sorry. I'll start over. The litigation is against the opioid manufacturers, distributors, and retail pharmacies. The manufacturers, our allegations are that they misbranded, mismarketed, and misproduced science as it relates to opioids. They said that opioids are safer than NSAIDs because an NSAID will cause renal failure and kill you, but an opioid will just cause you to be constipated. But don't worry about that because we sell the drug to fix that. So that's why we are going after the manufacturers, distributors. McKesson, which is the largest distributor in the United States, has a distribution center in Aurora, Colorado, paid a landmark fine in January of last year for $150 million for knowingly violating the Controlled Substance Abuse Act of 1970. And that is a large number monetarily. However, they make $100 million a week. The retail pharmacies are also culpable for their liability under the Controlled Substance Abuse Act for not knowingly reporting suspicious orders to the DEA. While I say that these are allegations, these are things that have been admitted to in consent decrees and settlements dating back to as far as the early 2000s. So our partner in this litigation, his name is Joe Rice. He is the master architect of the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, the BP litigation, Volkswagen, Takata airbags, to name a few. He is co-lead of this, and the settlement negotiations are ongoing every single day at his office in Charleston, South Carolina. The litigation's primary focus at this point in time is for injunctive relief, because as Judge Polster said in his first status conference on January 9th, every single day 150 people will die as a consequence of this epidemic. And if we don't do something to stem the tide and to right this wrong right now, will do something that we haven't done since the early 1900s in the flu epidemic, and we will have shortened Americans' lifespans for 3 consecutive years in a row, and it's directly attributable to this epidemic.
And go ahead if you have another
I
question.
just wanted to clarify, these are prescription.
Correct. So
Opioids, right?
let me back up just a little bit.
Okay.
It's, the lawsuit is against manufacturers of prescription opioids. So primarily Purdue, and then there are other companies that make a brand of prescription opioid, as well as the distributors. So they're, the 30,000-foot view is simply that in the early 90s, these companies took a drug, which is opioid, which is a synthetic form of heroin, and they took it from a palliative care condition. It used to be, it's made for end-stage cancer. It's made to make the quality of life as you're dying better. They took that drug, which is, again, morphine or heroin, and they determined a way to put it into the mass market as a pain reliever for chronic pain. And the way they did that, and this is all, as Sam said, this is all documented in consent decrees or judgments or settlements or findings of fact in other cases. So none of this is speculation. This is all proven out. What Purdue and these other large producers did was they hired doctors to say that these highly addictive opioids, first of all, were not addictive, and second, were better at managing pain than a Tylenol or Advil, things like that. They then used their money to create medical foundations such as the American Pain Society, which, if you didn't know any better, would look like a legitimate peer-reviewed medical society that did peer-reviewed research and created data. In fact, it was fully funded by Purdue, or the distributors and the manufacturers, to basically churn out whatever they needed to say to support that these drugs were useful for pain management. And essentially, without getting into the weeds too much, over the last 20 years, they've been making a great deal of money off of these products, and every time they get to a point where they're about to their patent is about to expire or they're about to face some issue, they either rework their patent or they settle a little bit a case here, or they do something just to keep enough working so they don't have to actually deal with it. And we don't have to explain the crisis that everybody reads about every day in Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. Colorado is actually in the middle of this pack in terms of the 50 states that in terms of the impact. And that can be borne out with a bunch of different statistics, but that includes overdose deaths directly attributable to opioids, ER visits, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Every single department that you have in your city has some touch of opioids. So that's kind of where it is. And the litigation is, all of the lawsuits that have been filed have been consolidated in one court to make it easier. That's kind of the very first
So
version.
would we have any financial obligation if we joined the litigation?
None.
What responsibility would we have if we joined?
I would need to speak with your chief of police, chief of fire, chief of EMS. I would need to speak with the hospitals. I'd need to speak with your individuals responsible for workers' compensation claims and all of the county dollars that go towards paying for city employees to obtain opioids. I need all of that claims data, and I have proprietary software that can quantify and put all of that information into a viable complaint.
But if a city employee did not want their information out there, I mean, are you respectful of
Everything
anonymity?
is desensitized.
Okay.
It's patient A through Z or
Okay.
double A.
Everything is confidential and private, and the information that we're referring to, we have about 10 categories that we will send people into the offices after we make sure that there's any HIPAA issues or anything like that, to the extent that there are, and we extract that data. It's totally anonymous. There are no names or social security numbers attached. It's literally just the data, where pills go and who's prescribing them, things like that. So there's no names or data associated with it.
There is, however, there are names that we do name, and those are the bad actors and nurses that have had their licenses revoked as a consequence of diverting drugs. So that would be the only circumstance where we name somebody.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews.
I have kind of multiple questions, but they're all just very related. A, how do we establish standing? How do we establish that we were damaged? How do we establish the amount that we were damaged? And then that, what you just said there, is that, are we talking now as a city about city employees only, or is it the whole citizenry, and then how do we get into that pool?
Let me address standing, and then and Sam can talk some more about some of those issues. First of all, standing has been essentially established as a threshold across the nation. Again, there's over 500 plaintiffs. The first lawsuit in this issue was filed in 2014 in the city of Chicago. The issues of each claim for damages or cause of action each were subject to motions to dismiss. The issue of standing was addressed, and the standing is simply that the communities have citizenry who have been affected either by being addicted to these medications as well as suffering deaths and direct harm. So there's direct standing for the municipality to bring an action on behalf of its citizens to deal with the categories of damage that are provable. For example, with your hospitals, if we are examining the amount of overdoses and things like that, that data shows actual damage, and that speaks to a little bit of your second question. And I'm trying to make sure we don't go too far into attorney-client issues because we have some proprietary information. But basically, you have standing because it's very obvious that the community has been damaged. Your damages will be proven by each department that can come and say, here is what our budget looks like, here are the things that are happening because we're spending this kind of money on diverting people into the hospital and responding to opioid calls. We just talked to the chief of West Metro, who was discussing the fact that they're doing some type of EMT work where they're responding to overdoses, things like that. So there's a lot of nuanced ways to categorize the damages, but we have 10 categories that fall all the way from child protective services to police response calls, EMTs, hospitalization, things like that. Did I get everything?
Additional questions? Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess along those lines, as it relates to the damages within the city, and I don't want to discount the damages that individuals have felt related to the overdose deaths and the tragedies that go along with that, but as it relates specifically to the city of Wheat Ridge, the only data that I'm able to get is through the Medicare Part D prescriber data, and that shows us that the city of Wheat Ridge is anywhere from 2.9% to as much as 6% as it relates to their prescriber rates, and the state average is at 7%. So even within the state of Colorado, and the state of Colorado being in the middle of the pack, the city of Wheat Ridge has a lower prescriber rate than most. And as you look at those prescriber numbers, 4 doctors were responsible for prescribing 25% of all the opioid prescriptions in the city of Wheat Ridge. So you're going after the manufacturers, the distributors, and the pharmacies, but not the ones that actually prescribe it, especially in situations where they're just literally less than a handful of doctors are the ones that have prescribed more than 25% of all opioids in our community.
And I'd be happy to answer that in an executive session, why it is that we aren't going after individual doctors.
Thank you.
And I guess, I have another question on this. I don't understand where the damages are to the city if we have a less than below average rate of prescriber in this category. I understand that there are individual damages, but where do those damages break as far as this is what would normally be occurring as people are being prescribed medication and this is what's occurring versus some obscene damage above and beyond that, or how do you break that?
Again, I'm going to have to refer you to, I have to answer that question in executive session. I can't answer that question in public.
Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
So I just have a couple questions, just in general. I'm kind of along the lines of Mr. Urban, just trying to figure out where the city of Wheat Ridge falls within this lawsuit. I mean, earlier in your discussions, you were talking about you'd get data from Wheat Ridge as far as employees and insurance and those types of things. And to me, that's specific to Wheat Ridge, the city of Wheat Ridge, and employment and how it might impact. I look at the list here: lost productivity, and health insurance. So I understand that a little bit. But then I do understand the criminal justice part of it, like how much more is it to the police force, and how much more time and is it costing us? But then I look at the substance abuse treatment. I guess my question is or I don't even know if it's a question, but part of it is, like you were saying, well, we'll have to work with the hospital, et cetera, et cetera. Well, yes, we do have, Lutheran Medical Center in the city of Wheat Ridge, but it would be the city of Wheat Ridge in this lawsuit, not Lutheran Medical Center. So I guess then if Lutheran Medical Center says, well, yeah, we write off, $62 million, let's just pretend they don't, but, $62 million in Narcan every year, or of writing off physician bills and ambulances and all of these things because these are uninsured and et cetera, but these damages wouldn't be going to Lutheran, correct? Because they're not the lawsuit. So I guess I question, like when you're saying, well, we'd get the data from the hospitals, but some of these people that are getting the damages or having to pay for the damages or pay for these expenses aren't getting the dollars.
Sam, I'll let you step in, but I did want to say, so every client is individual, obviously. So the city of Wheat Ridge, you're exactly right. Perhaps the hospital system may bear most of those hospital costs. However, if you think about the lifespan of what an overdose looks like, from beginning to use the drug to perhaps go either dying or coming out of rehab, things like that. There's a police response. There are other parts that may identify more fully with Wheat Ridge and where your damage may be. You may not have any direct medical costs associated. We can't be sure of that until we actually get in and analyze the data. So again, without going in too deeply with that, but you're exactly right. If the hospital is doing that and it's private, then that's not part of your damage. What I think the way to look at it is they're a partner with the city who might be able to show and verify some of the damages for the sheriff or EMTs who are responding where you are actually having to foot some of the bill.
Additional questions? Ms. Duran?
Mostly a comment. For me personally, I feel we need to hold the manufacturers, distributors, and retail pharmaceuticals responsible for this. I know it's more than just a one-prong approach, but I think we need to start somewhere. And I think gathering the data, not all cases are reported. We can have percentages, but not all of them are reported. And that's what your job would be to discover, right? To reach out to all the other entities to discover this. So for me personally, I support this. I feel it is an epidemic. It's touched all of us personally in one way or another. And any way we can try to make them accountable and create guidelines moving forward. I don't know if that's been discussed or if that's even something that's discussed with you regarding treatment in the future with doctors. Because I've seen doctors prescribe, pain meds for 14 days, another 14 days, on and on. So guidelines are really important, I think, and criteria moving forward. So is that something that's in the discussion?
We already have that set up. I can't discuss anything further than that.
Okay, but it is being discussed,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
that's something positive. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Matthews?
We're kind of talking around all this too. If we join on to this as a city, I'm still trying to establish, I see some issues here. Is number one, we will spend, Chief is going to have some guy go through tons and tons and tons and years of records. That's going to cost, let's just say for grins, it costs us $200,000 to get to what the police department has spent on dealing with this crisis, okay? Then at some point in time, and if we're suing the manufacturer, do we have to then break down those costs and how much of it was based on someone who overdosed on prescription opioids versus someone who could no longer figure out a way to get prescriptions and went over to illegally obtaining opioids? And then where does the someone going into rehab part fall in this? I guess what I'm saying is if the chief spends $200,000 figuring this out, then I'm also being a numbers guy, what's the return?
So first, we've been doing this for over 4 years. So Chief, his exposure, we already know how to go in and get that data. Any time, money, and dollars spent by the city in the investigation on behalf of this litigation, we claim as damages and retribution at the end. The city will not be liable for any costs associated with the investigation associated with that. We bear all costs associated with this investigation and litigation and or appeals. As it relates to somebody no longer being able to obtain prescription opioids and going to heroin, we can make that connection, and that's part of our complaint, is to tie these individual defendant companies to heroin. And we have the databases and information necessary to extract the information and to tie them to that. And what was the third part of the question, sorry?
Well, what's the return? In other words,
We can't.
Unless you guys are going to have someone come and sit down at the police department's database, which I'm not sure we can even allow anyone to do that, he's still going to, I mean, there's a cost involved there that I think the city's going to have to end up generating, and then what would be the return? And let's just say it comes out to $200,000 for round numbers. West Metro has nothing to do with us, so that's a separate issue. They're a fire district.
Correct.
And we just, although we have to go back and see what happened when Wheat Ridge Fire Department was still, but I think they were a district too. So how does this all fall
Chief, have you
together?
got any insight?
So I don't think that it'll cost anywhere near $200,000, Larry. With current analysis software we have, we can enter in opioids, we can enter in heroin, we'll be able to pull up case report numbers, and then I imagine there's some research that would be done through them. So we'd have to talk in more detail, in regards to that. But there are a number of jurisdictions, law enforcement jurisdictions, that have joined these lawsuits, and so we would work within the Criminal Justice Records Act. But we've got an analysis software. I can go to my analysis software and type in heroin and put a year range there in every case that we've been out on that's involved heroin, for instance. We can pull up and look at CR numbers and then define those searches down even more. So, I'd certainly need more information from these folks if you all decide to do that. But I'm not overly concerned right now that it would take up a tremendous amount of time.
Thank you, Chief. Ms. Dozeman and Mr. Fitzgerald on deck.
Thank you. So I'm glad you came to the mic because my question is more directed to you, Chief Brennan. What kind of harm do you see within our community, and does it justify entering into litigation such as this?
I'm sorry, I missed part of it. What kind of harm?
Yeah, what kind of harm do you think is within our community relating to this opioid issue?
Well, certainly the two biggest issues that I'm seeing from a drug perspective in this community are around heroin and methamphetamine. I think, in the last study I looked at in terms of Colorado as a state, we went from about 10 years ago, about 20 deaths related to heroin, to 427 in 2016. I mean, it's a pretty significant impact. We were involved in a case just this last week. Our drug investigators, with a search warrant that recovered multiple kilos of heroin, guns, and currency. It's probably one of the biggest issues right now in terms of law enforcement. We're working with Jeffco Department of Health, their Points West program.
which is a syringe exchange program to try to address, the issue of HIV and other communicable drugs. So there's a lot of work that law enforcement is involved in with public health and with others to try to deal with this issue of opioids in our community. And most of what we're seeing is heroin, but we can certainly take a deeper dive and look at that. And I'll have some information, I think, coming up in June when I give you my annual cannabis report. So.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you.
I think reducing the use of opiate-based drugs is a public good. And from that point of view, regardless of all the details, since it's part of our job to look after the public good, I personally will vote for this. I think nobody has said this specifically, but you're taking this case on a contingency. Is that right? So we have no obligation financially, and we have no downside. So to me, it's clear we should go ahead with this. It promotes a public good, and we take no risk, costs us nothing.
Are there more questions or a sense of the council? Mr. Matthews.
Just one more question. Are the courts allowing for punitive in addition to actual damages, and what does that look like?
They have been alleged. Other than them being alleged, I can't discuss in open session how they're being addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Rand.
I just wanted to say I would ask that council just remember that our first responsibility and obligation as elected officials is our public and our community. And this is not making us responsible for anything except for our citizens. So I'd hope you think about that as we ask for a consensus, which I'd like to ask for.
Before you do,
Unless there's more questions?
I would like to tell everybody that I attended a session at the Lutheran Hospital today where the governor of Colorado came and signed 4 pieces of legislation about opioid addiction, about legislation that's been through the State House and was signed by the governor today. I was very honored to have the governor come and be with our great partner, Lutheran Medical Center. So this is a topic that's right at the top of the forefront of our public dialogue and does impact citizens in Wheat Ridge. Thank you. I would welcome a consensus motion.
All right, thank you. I would like to get a consensus for the city to join in the national opioid litigation.
That's, we have a majority on that?
5, yep.
Okay. And we will move forward with that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, council.
Can we take a couple of minutes?
We can, if you need to, yeah.
All right, we've been at this a little more than 2 hours. Let's take about a 5-minute recess if we can. Okay, we have all of our counselors back, thank you. We will continue on to item number 5 on our agenda tonight. This is the NRS Steering Committee selection process. Mr. Goff, would you introduce this, please?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you all know, City Council entered into a contract with, what's that? Who's that? Is that you? Something exploding? Can we keep going? Is your recording stop? Nope, still going. City Council entered into a contract with CCB to do perform an update on the 2005 NRS. Part of that process will involve a very large, robust public engagement process. And as part of that, the CCB recommends that City Council appoint a steering committee to help out with this effort. Is that your power pack? Oh, okay. Somebody's timer. We got to go. Make a decision.
Okay, order in the chamber.
So one of the recommendations of our consultant is to create a steering committee. And attached in your packet is a 2-page document that has some parameters that they recommend for selecting this committee. They have the size of the group, characteristics of the members, kind of what different categories of the community these committee members come from. To keep it quick, I'll go straight to some recommendations on how I think City Council could proceed with this. Is a couple different things, and all these options consider the fact that we recommend you follow these guidelines created by CZB. So either option 1 would be that staff and CCB. First of all, we create an application for a steering committee that includes enough information on there so that we can determine if they're meeting the parameters recommended by CZB. We submit and distribute that application widely as possible with a deadline of at the end of May. And then once we get those in, we can either do 1 or 2 or 3 things. Either the staff and CZB work together to create a slate of candidates based on those parameters set up in the guidelines and submit those to City Council for review. Potentially City Council could select a committee of council members to do that job, or the entire City Council could go through the applications in a future study session. The goal is to have a steering committee selected by July 9th. They've scheduled the first kickoff meeting for, I believe, July 15th with the steering committee. So I'll cut it off there and answer any questions that you may have. I think the memo and the guidelines were pretty self-explanatory.
Discussion, Ms. Dozeman.
I just have a question about one of the 9 strategies. What do you mean by develop West 44th into an orchard district?
That was a strategy that was in the original 2005 NRS. I'd have to pull that up again. There was, the intent at that point was 44th Avenue was, has Heine's Market. They used to have a lot of garden centers and orchards, and I think the vision at that point was, look at creating that type of same setting for 44th Avenue. Again, that was just a recommendation in the 2005 NRS. There was the Fruitdale sub-area plan that was created for 44th Avenue that captures some of that orchard district environment.
So are we carrying over those strategies, or is the steering committee going to be redirecting based on where we're at right now?
Yeah, the steering committee will help have that conversation with the community and with City Council and Planning Commission and others to have that conversation to determine, what the next NRS priority should be.
Additional questions, comments? Ms. Duran?
I would like to see maybe a 10th item on there regarding affordable, attainable housing, for them to look at areas where we could do that. Maybe not necessarily new builds, but maybe existing, rundown buildings that we have. Just, I really would like them to look at that. So if we could make that an item on there?
Well, again, just to clarify, this was just some background on
Okay.
where we're at. These were the recommendations that were in the 2005 NRS. So this is just to give you some background on what the NRS was. I think it's an open table on what the new NRS will be and what recommendations come out of it. You guys will be part of that, of course, and that
Have some feedback
you
on
should
that?
have, yeah, you should discuss that at that point.
Mr.
Great.
Fitzgerald.
Just getting right to the heart of the matter. I think that the option one is the best option. That's the one that I would vote for. And there really are two basic reasons for that. One is, I think to a certain extent, time is of the essence here. That July seems like it's a long time away, but it's going to take a while to create the form. It's going to take a while to create the form. It's going to take a while for it to be on the website and to be distributed by other ways, however we decide to distribute that or they decide to distribute that. And then we're going to wait a certain amount of time for people to reply. And so I think if we do it that way, we have the best chance of getting this done in a quick and efficient manner. The other options, God love us, we are a council that loves to talk. So I can imagine us, in the other options, I can imagine us using a lot of time to narrow down exactly how we're going to do this, and do we get somebody from every district, and is it the same old faces or is it somebody different? It's all those kinds of questions. And so my feeling is the option one is the most efficient and fastest way to get this done. So that's what I would suggest.
Okay. Ms. Dozman?
And I would actually say that 3C, having the entire city council review the applications at the July 2nd study session and voting on them on July 9th. All of the options have a July 9th voting, so it wouldn't, extend the amount of time that we would need in order to make this election. But I would say that it would be most equitable for the entire city council to weigh in on this committee as opposed to just staff or just a couple of council members.
Mr. Duran?
Yes. I lean toward option 3 because I think as counselors, we pretty much know who, has been involved in our community. Plus, I think together in our districts, we can kind of take a look and see who, what, where, when. So option 3. And also, I'd like us to add Gazette onto number 2. It says Wheat Ridge Transcript, but doesn't have the neighborhood Gazette.
Yeah, it'll be, those are examples. It'll be included
wanted to
everywhere
make
as
sure I said
possible.
it.
Yep.
All right, thanks.
Additional comments?
Option 3.
Mr. Matthews? Okay. Ms. Davis?
I have just a quick question on option 3. I mean, I'm fine with going with option 3, but and I know it's that the candidates will be reviewed, but I guess I know in the past we've kind of had each district have a certain amount. So, I mean, are we going to shoot for that? I mean, I know it said 16 to 22 members or something, so I don't know if we start off and say, each district chooses 3, that would give 12, and then from there could be a couple mayoral appointments. I'm okay with option 3, but I just think there probably needs to be just a bit more structure, because I think it's going to be hard for us all to, if we are so lucky, and I hope we are, to have 50 applicants, then how are we going to drill that down? So I'd rather work with my counterpart in my district to recommend our 3 appointments and kind of have every district do that and have a couple ad hocs or mayoral appointments and stuff.
I'm good with that.
Mr. Goff?
I'm sorry, I just want to jump on that. And another way we could potentially help you, once all the application, if you want to go with number 3, once all applications come in, we can categorize them in a spreadsheet and tick off all the different categories that person meets. Are they from what district they are? If you're okay with these parameters that the CZB recommends, what district they're from, how long have they lived in the city, are they a renter, are they a homeowner? We could tick them off so you guys have that, and then you can pick by district.
Have a little staff assistance to assemble the.
Yeah, we'll make sure the application has all that information, but we'll even put it on a spreadsheet so it's easier for you guys to review.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
I was just going to say, the problem that I see, though, is what we're going to come up with is the usual suspects. Well, I know, but if we can commit to not, I guess that would be good, because we're not trying to get the usual suspects. We're trying to get
A little bit of both. We'll hold each other accountable, right?
Okay.
Okay.
We'll make it diverse.
Mr. Urban?
I don't know if Kaiser Soze is going to apply, so I don't know if all the usual suspects will be there, but the 22 people is a lot of people, and I don't even know if we have 22 usual suspects. So I think even if you included all those, you'd still have 10 more spots to fill. So I wouldn't want to exclude someone from their active participation in our community as far as participating in this, but I understand that we want to try to get a good mix in, but it's a tall order to get 22 people to participate in something like this to begin with. So I don't want to exclude someone's interest just because they've been around the block. So
Additional discussion? I would entertain a motion for a consensus.
I'd like to move on.
Davis?
I would like to get a consensus from the group that we move forward with option 3.
Option 3C?
3C. And that we work on an application that kind of has the parameters on it. Then we'll publicize the application, and also as council, we'll receive the application and perhaps send it out to some folks that are not usual suspects, and we'll start hitting the pavement and getting some work done on it.
Is there consensus on that motion? That's the way we will proceed. Do you have enough information on that?
I do, thank you.
Okay.
Does that mean that we have to have them identify whether or not they're the usual suspect?
That's up to you. That's up to you guys to decide.
We'll make that subjective analysis ourselves. Okay. That concludes all of the action items on our agenda. Staff reports?
I have nothing.
Nothing tonight. Elected officials reports. Raise your hand if you have an elected official report. Ms. Dozman.
I would just like to congratulate our Wheat Ridge High School seniors for graduating last week. You guys did a fantastic job, and I just wanted to recognize how important you are to our community, and I wish you all of the best in your future.
Anyone else? I would like to sort of close us off with thanking Lutheran Medical Center for hosting the governor of the state of Colorado to sign some important legislation in our city. So thank you all for being here. This meeting is adjourned.